That tells us the recording's in progress. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up this document as well, and I will screen share. Before I do that, does anyone have any questions from last week? Or anything that's arisen since that you think, oh, this is actually a question I'd really like to ask. So kind of opening it up for anyone who has any questions first. You'll have to unmute if you do. Oh, so you've learned everything about symbols of the home and synagogue. That's great. I'm very pleased. Okay. Rosh Hashanah for Foundation.
I have a question, actually. I couldn't find the unmute button.
Okay.
And it was after our back and forth a little bit. I wanted to clarify something. I know that at least in terms of like consumable meat, there's a really specific process for the slaughter. I want to say it's shefarot, but I don't remember if that's right.
Shechita, I'll write that down for you.
Close enough. I was wondering if that's if the animals used for like ritual artifacts like Torah scrolls and shofars and things like that also have to be slaughtered in that way, or if they can have a different process.
No, these are products of shechita. So if you have any, if you are using anything animal, it needs to be done from that process, basically. Great question, thank you. Yeah, shechita that's the ritual slaughtering of an animal. Kosher slaughter, actually, I mean, we will come to kashrut in future weeks. Kosher slaughter is actually really interesting. Quite bluntly, you take an extremely sharp knife and you slice through the neck, slicing the jugular, and you do it unbelievably fast. And the jugular is where the nerves are that carry the pain, and so the animal bleeds out but doesn't know it's bleeding. So it's not actually feeling anything. There was a time, I'd say probably in the 80s or 90s, when they were, some kashrut authorities were putting animals like sheep in these little pens, basically, and they turn the pens upside down, and then they do the slaughter, the slice. And that was banned, actually, by EU law, who said that's really cruel. Now, there are some countries which are trying to ban shechita, to ban kosher slaughter. They say it's much more humane to shoot the animal in the head with stunning or something like that. As it is, actually, statistically speaking, the animal dies much less quick. No, how do I put this? The stunning process is more likely to go wrong than the shechita process. Because when you stun an animal, if you don't get it exactly right, you have to do it again. In shechita, you never do it again, right? If you have to do a second cut, you've literally invalidated the shechita process. So when people move against shechita and say it's cruel, Jews tend to turn around and say, look at your process first, because actually, shooting an animal twice in the head is actually worse. So at the same time, the visceral thing, when you look at shechita, it looks gross. Actually, that was what turned me vegetarian. I actually went to a conference by a group called Animal Aid, and they had a thing with a video of undercover shechita. I was like, okay. I said, you know what? I eat kosher meat. I may as well have a look. And I watched it. I thought, I'm never eating meat again. Because even though the animal's not in pain, it's cutting the throat of the cow, and the blood is just gushing out. And it's really difficult to watch. And then what happens is basically the cow's like, there's lots of people like around here. I don't know what they're doing. I feel sleepy. And then it's gone, right? But to watch, it's really gross. So I can understand why people might make a push against shechita to say, look at it, it's just pouring blood everywhere, but actually the animal isn't feeling anything. To be a shochet is a slaughterer. To be a shochet requires really special training. because you have to be able to get the knife exactly right, and you have to be able to get to the animal exactly right, and so on. So, so that's just a brief aside about shechita, about the kosher slaughter process. Excuse me, anything that we use ritually have been shechted, as people often say. That's a word, but not really a word. Shechted. I shechted the cow, right? Which means I slaughtered the cow, yeah? In the traditional shechita way, right? Okay, any other questions, general questions, or questions following on from last week? Okay, so then I shall share my screen. And Rosh Hashanah for foundations. Elul and Rosh Hashanah. Okay, we are in the month of Elul. Jewish months are 28 or 29 days long. We will look at the calendar because in the secular calendar that we follow, we have a leap day. We call it a leap year if it's a leap year, if it has a leap day in it. In Judaism, we have a leap year if it has a leap month in it, right? We can have an extra month. We have Adar, the month of Adar, in which we find Purim, and sometimes we have Adar Sheni, a second Adar. So it's an entirely extra month. I actually had this conversation with my kids over dinner yesterday when we were talking about, is Rosh Hashanah early or late? Actually, I'm going to stop sharing. Is Rosh Hashanah early or late this year? This is a very common thing that you hear people say. Oh, Rosh Hashanah is quite early this year. Oh, Rosh Hashanah is quite late this year. What does that mean? What it means is that Jewish festivals move in the Roman calendar, in the secular calendar, right? So a Jewish month is 28 or 29 days long. A secular month is 30, 31 days long. So you're going to have a time where you have a bit of a lag. In Islam, the calendar is totally lunar. So what happens is 1 year you'll have Ramadan in September, and then the next year you'll have it maybe in August, and then the next year you'll have it in July, and it will keep moving, and it can move all the way throughout the year. In Judaism, we have a lunar solar calendar. And what that means is a lunar calendar corrected by the sun. So for example, Pesach is a spring festival. So you can't have Pesach in December. It wouldn't work. So as the festivals get earlier and earlier, because you've got fewer and fewer days in the month, so you're gaining 3 days a month, basically, occasionally you add an extra month. And that makes the festival late this year. I actually created a meme with, what's his name, Gandalf, saying a festival is neither late nor early, a festival arrives exactly when it means to. But essentially, this year, actually, the festivals are quite late, with Rosh Hashanah starting right at the end of September. Sometimes it's on my sister's birthday, on September the 11th. I'm going to sneeze. Excuse me. Sometimes Hanukkah can start in November. Sometimes it can end in January. So sometimes you'll often hear Jews say, oh, festival, Rosh Hashanah is quite late this year. That's what they mean, okay? It's a lunar solar calendar, but corrected by the sun so that the festivals are always around the same season. Judaism is extremely seasonal. Okay, so we're in the month of Elul. Elul is the post-exilic name. In other words, from the exile, from the Babylonian invasion. So the post-exilic name of the 6th month in the Jewish year. Now you might say, hold on a minute, how can it be the 6th month if we're just about to come up to Rosh Hashanah, the new year? Because in Judaism, we don't just have one new year, we actually have 4 new years. There's the calendar new year, the religious new year, the new year for kings, and the new year for trees. There's also kind of the new year for tithes. So for some people in the counting, the calendar starts in Nisan, which is around spring. So it does get a bit complicated. So what you need to remember is not necessarily it's the 6th month, but it's the month before Rosh Hashanah. That's the key thing about Elul. The name is Babylonian, was subsequently adopted in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic. We first read about it in the book of Nehemiah. It invariably consists of 29 days, The first of Elul never falls on a Tuesday, a Thursday, or a Shabbat. So now, actually in this handout, there's a few questions. The first of Elul never falls on a Tuesday, a Thursday, or a Shabbat. Can anyone work out why? This is very deliberate. Why can the first of Elul never be on a Tuesday, a Thursday, or Shabbat? It's a difficult question. Any thoughts? I'll tell you if you want, but you're welcome to take a guess. It's all about... Oh, go on, Cindy.
Is it because there is, you don't want it to coincide with Shabbat, the high holidays?
Exactly right. Exactly right. Right? Because if you are preparing for Rosh Hashanah, for example, you don't want Rosh Hashanah to fall on a Saturday night, because then you can't prepare your food during Shabbat. And so it's all that kind of thing. It also relates to when Yom Kippur will fall, right? And food and not food. You can have Yom Kippur on Shabbat. It's actually considered to be a very good thing, right? You don't want Yom Kippur the day after Shabbat finishing on a Saturday night, because then you've got a problem with food and so on. So, yes, it's exactly that. It's all very carefully worked out. What I will say is that the ancient rabbis were extremely good at astronomy. They were very bad at cosmology. So astronomy is looking at celestial objects and working them out, having a calendar and working out, like, oh, this is moving here, this is moving here, this month's going to go here, and so on. However, they still thought, in terms of cosmology, that the Earth was flat and had a domed sky, and these things were moving around, even though a number of other nations around them knew that wasn't the case. So, so they were really good at astronomy. So the calendar has been working for a long, long time. And the good thing about the Jewish calendar is you can now, it's so set according to certain rules that you can find out, like, when is Rosh Hashanah in the year 3257? And you can find out the exact date already. It's all really set. So it's a very set calendar. Okay.
Rabbi, question about that. Since Jewish days start at sundown, when you say that that Elul never starts on a Tuesday or Thursday, do you mean Tuesday, Thursday night?
Yes.
Or Monday, Wednesday night?
Yes, yes. Tuesday, Thursday night. So thank you. And just to remind, I think I mentioned this last time, but if not, why do Jewish days start in the evening? Because the Torah says in the Genesis, and there was evening and there was morning one day. So it's actually very interesting, because you could turn around and say, well, obviously the day starts when the sun comes up, right? That's what we're used to. And you turn around and say, why? Why is that obvious, right? You know, why doesn't the day start when the sun goes down? Because then that's a new day once the sun has gone down. There's no right or wrong. We're used to, you know, in our minds, we're used to thinking day starts, you know, but, and in fact, strictly speaking, for us, the day starts in the middle of the night, which really doesn't actually make much sense. So, to be blunt, you know, people say it's a new day. You wake up for a new day, right? Not in Judaism. In Judaism, you go to bed as the new day starts. So that, to me, is more Garfield, more akin. The older you get, the more you're like, yeah, I should start a new day by going to bed, I think. Okay. It precedes the 10 days of penitence. So the 10 days of penitence are the days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So Elul becomes a month of repentance and devotional practices. The rabbis realized something very clever. In the Song of Songs, there we go. In the Song of Songs 6:3, we have this phrase, Ani ledodi v'dodi li. I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. If you can use that as an acrostic. Now, I appreciate it says A there, right? But in Hebrew, it's an Aleph, right? Aleph, Lamed, Vav, Lamed, Elul. Ani ledodi v'dodi li and Elul are very similar in the way they're written. So why is that important? Because the rabbis say, this is the time to set that loving relationship between us and God. During the month of Elul, I become my beloved's and my beloved becomes mine. The relationship between either us as individuals and God, or more particularly, between the Jewish people and God. The shofar is sounded daily, except on Shabbat. Yeah, anyone work out why we would not blow the shofar on Shabbat? You're like, you didn't know I'd be asking so many questions. Normally I don't actually, but this one, why would we not blow the shofar on Shabbat? It's a bit difficult because I haven't introduced you to the rules of Shabbat yet. But you're not allowed to carry in public on Shabbat. And so therefore, if you are walking to services and carrying this, then that could be a problem. You can say, okay, fine, so leave it at the temple then. But it also, because you're blowing an instrument, you might be tempted. You remember last week I talked about the fence around the fence. You might be tempted to say, okay, well now I've blown this instrument, now I'm going to go and play the violin or something like that, or go and sit down and play the piano, which you traditionally wouldn't do. The shofar is the ram's horn. I'm going to blow this. It is blown every morning. You may not have heard it on Facebook Live this morning, so just in case, I'm going to blow it for you. There are a few different notes. I'm going to blow it first, and then I'll share the notes. I may have that later in the handout. So there is a blessing. Of course there's a blessing, because we're doing something. And every time you do anything, right, in Judaism, there's a blessing. It could be looking at a rainbow. It could be smelling spices. It could be smelling flowers. It could be seeing people of unusual appearance. That's a blessing we don't normally say because it's very judgmental. It could be, traditionally it was actually on seeing giants and dwarves was the actual original thing. So there could be a blessing on hearing thunder, on seeing lightning, right? We constantly say blessings in Judaism. A blessing after going to the bathroom, which is a really important one, saying, thank God it all works, that I can let it go, basically, right? It's a lovely blessing that's actually in the morning service because the expectation is that you just went to the toilet before prayer because you don't want to be full of shit while you're praying, basically. So that's actually proper halakha. Say, empty yourself out in prayer so that you can be filled with, divine presence and not that. So there's a blessing before hearing the sound of the shofar, lishmoa kol shofar, which literally means blessed are you, God. So the lishmoa, shema means to hear. So lishmoa is upon hearing. Kol is the sound or the voice. Shofar is the ram's horn. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Asher kedeshanu b'mitzvotav tzivanu lishmoa kol shofar. Okay, I can't believe that came off so well. Okay, so the first note. Okay, there are 3 different kinds of notes. Tekiah. Let me write them down. Teruah, whoops, no. And shuvarim. Okay, tekiah is the single note. Okay, teruah is this alarm, basically. That's the 3 notes. And then shavarim, shavar means broken. So to break. So shavarim is broken. And then there is also a final one. I'm not going to do because I'm going to be teaching and therefore I'll be out of breath. But the tekiah gadola. Gadol means big. The tekiah gadola is a big tekiah. Right? So this note. But you keep it going. You keep it going until basically you turn red and run out of breath and think, I'm just about to collapse. I should probably stop. My record is just over a minute. And that's why I'm not doing that now because otherwise I wouldn't be able to teach for the rest of the session. So we have these different notes which are meant to wake us up. They're meant to wake us, call us to repentance. They're meant to help us, focus ourselves. Hearing them every morning, I think is a lovely thing. Not so lovely for my neighbours, who I do it outside for Facebook Live, and then I set their dogs off. And at some point, I've been living here 7 years. At some point, someone's going to complain. I know they are. Although, interestingly, near the end of the month of Elul last year, somebody else knew that I was coming out at about 8:15 to blow the shofar because I was doing Elul live. And so I blow the shofar, and then they would blow the shofar somewhere in the housing association, and then someone else blew the shofar. And I thought, I can't believe we're doing this. That's what it's meant to be, that everyone hears it and enjoys it and so on. So at some point there's going to be a thing about in the HOA about Jews can't blow their horns, but we're enjoying it for now. So that's the shofar, the ram's horn. It's said it's bent to shape our hearts, to direct our hearts towards heaven. The reason it's bent is because it's a horn, and that's what it looks like. But you give it that sort of metaphorical rabbinic reasoning as well. And as I mentioned to someone over the week, it connects to the Akedah. Let me write this down. The Akedah, which is Genesis 22. The Akedah is the binding of Isaac. God calls to Abraham and says, take your son, your only one whom you love, Isaac, and offer him up on Mount Moriah. And so dad and son schlep all the way to Mount Moriah. They carry the wood, and Isaac starts to notice something's going on here, and says, where is the offering? And Abraham says, God will provide the offering, my son, which is a rather clever way of answering and also saying the offering is going to be my son. As they get to the point where Abraham is just about, as they get to the point where Abraham is just about to slaughter his son, an angel calls out, Avraham, Avraham. He responds, Hineni, here I am, which is an important biblical word. And the angel says, don't do that. Are you Meshuggah? Are you crazy? Of course, don't kill your son, right? Well done. You've passed the test. Have a ram. And they look behind, and there's a ram caught by its horn in the thicket. And so this reminds us of that story, particularly because of the idea of giving ourselves to God, of doing whatever it takes. However, there's a real problem with this Akedah story, which is I don't think it's very good for people to turn around and say, I'm going to sacrifice my child for God, right? If I heard a voice of God saying, kill Asher, I'd get myself locked up. Right? I wouldn't go, oh yes, that's how to be Jewish. I'd say, I need really serious help right now. So it connects us with that story, but also there's a lot of questions with that story. But that's the shofar, the ram's horn. It's actually fairly easy to blow. If you play trumpet or oboe, as I did when I was a kid, or clarinet, it's much easier to blow. You just basically making raspberries into a ram's horn. It's the shofar, this shofar I've had for 20 years or so, can be made of other animals. Ibex, we actually have an enormous shofar. I'm not sure where it's gone, actually. It must be about 2, maybe 3 feet long. Really long, really deep, low sound. You can have a number of different animals. As I mentioned last week, not cow in case of the concern of the golden calf and idolatry. Okay, let's have a look.
Rabbi, I have a quick question about that too.
Please.
I just want a clarification. I believe that it's considered a mitzvah to hear the shofar, but not to blow it. Why?
Okay.
Because wouldn't it be considered a mitzvah to help others fulfill their mitzvahs?
Let me of the shofar. Right. So the blessing is lishmoa, to hear. We have the same blessing for the Megillat Esther, for the book of Esther. The mitzvah is the person who is doing it, who is blowing the shofar, is enabling others to perform that mitzvah. If you had that the mitzvah was to cause others to hear it, then everyone would be fighting to do it. I'll blow the shofar in temple. I'll blow the shofar in temple. It's like, no. We just all need to hear. We're just going to have one person doing it. Thank you. And so I actually quite like the idea that it's to hear, because it's that sort of, you can't help but hear it. You know what I mean? You just have to be in the right place. As opposed to if the mitzvah were that you must blow the shofar, we actually find ourselves with a problem, which is everyone has to find a shofar, everyone has to buy a shofar, and so on. And so that's, I think that makes it a little more difficult. So I prefer it as lishmo, as to hear, actually.
The reason I ask, and I think that this was on a Orthodox website, so it's not something that I'm like theologically down with anyway, but because if I remember right, they said that it didn't count to hear a shofar that you had blown yourself.
So yes, yes, that's true. In Orthodox halacha, in Orthodox law, so that you can be sure that you are going to another minyan or you're going to hear something else. I don't hold by that. I actually think it's we have a lot of people in our community who live by themselves. We have a lot of people who are isolated, and maybe that works, 1,000 years ago when Jews were all living in the shtetl, and so they can just go and okay, I've blown it, now I need to go and hear it. When you've got someone who lives an hour and a half away, then that's not really very fair, frankly. And so I don't think that addresses the reality of modern day living, to be honest. And I also think there's something very powerful about when you blow the shofar, especially for those who aren't used to doing it, over the month of Elul, and you get better and better and better at it. So by the end of the month, you're like, I've got this note. Then you're really hearing it. You're hearing it in a different way, and you're hearing yourself improve at the shofar as you are hopefully improving internally. So I think it's actually very nice to be able to have that as, hearing the sound of what I'm trying to create and so on. So, but yeah, you're right.
Yeah, that's what I did last year. My neighbors were less and less happy with me also. But I blew it for myself last year, and it was super meaningful for me to do that during Elul. So yeah, thank you for clarifying.
I don't know, in Orthodox halacha, in Orthodox law, I don't know if hearing it electronically counts. There is a discussion about when you hear Kaddish, the mourner's prayer, do you respond? So if you are watching a service being streamed and they start saying Kaddish, good question, Crystal, come to you in a second. If you hear the Kaddish being streamed, do you respond? Some people say no because you're not really hearing it. Others say yes. Those who say yes, you do respond, however, do turn around and say, if it is in a movie, then you don't respond. If it was pre-recorded, then you don't respond. That was actually a very interesting thing. I was aware of this when Schindler's List came out. Because at one point, right near the end of Schindler's List, they say Kaddish. And I just stood up and I was just like, I'm saying this. And I knew, right, I knew that it was... I knew it was pre-recorded. I knew the halacha says, you don't respond because it's not a real prayer. I was like, I'm just too bereft right now after having watched this movie. So, can women also blow the shofar? Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. The mitzvah is to hear it. So therefore, anyone can blow it. Now, you may have, for some people, turn around and say, yes, but just as men should lead prayer, then they should also blow the shofar. Fine. If they want to do that in their communities, that's fine. To argue against a woman blowing a shofar, I think, really takes a lot of stretches. Yeah. Saroj and Cindy take turns blowing the shofar. Right. There you go. Okay. Anything else about Elul? It says, how might you prepare for Rosh Hashanah? The idea of Elul is Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year, New Year, is really big. Rabbinic Agadah, rabbinic story, connects the special significance of Elul with the 40 days of Moses staying on Mount Sinai, which was said to have started on the 1st of Elul and ended on the 10th of Tishri on Yom Kippur. So the rabbis say, just as Moses was engaged in this being in God's presence for 40 days, so you, during the month of Elul and all the way through Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur, should be engaged in God's presence. So Elul is a time for preparation. The cartoon that I may have shared last week, or I may have mentioned it at a Torah study, is repent now, avoid the high holy day rush. And there's a real reality to that, actually. People say I come to services regularly, and I think, yeah, regularly twice a year. But that is regular for them, right? Because they come on Rosh Hashanah, they come on Yom Kippur, and people, descend on the temple who you haven't seen before. And I'm not disparaging it, because everyone is entitled to their own religious observance, and at least they're coming on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But the problem is that arrival and immediate, like, I'm confronted with, I'm a terrible person, I have to atone. And actually you need a process. You need to sort of deconstruct the self a little, hold the self and deconstruct and say, right, here's where I've been going wrong, and here's the bits where I'm really good, actually, and I need to hold on to them. And that's what the month of Elul is really for. It's for preparing ourselves for the high holy days. I don't know if I shared the story with you or with someone else recently. I tend to share a lot of the same stories around the same time. On Yom Kippur, in my family, we used to go to services, every Friday service, every Saturday service, every festival service. If there was a Pesach morning service, we would miss school for it. That's quite conservative. So we were really quite observant in terms of synagogue attendance. And when it came to Yom Kippur, between the 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are the days when you're meant to atone. You're meant to go to those who you've wronged, and you're meant to apologize. And you're meant to sincerely atone and say, you know what, I'm going to try to do better next year. We never did that in our family. What we did was we would drive to the Kol Nidre service, the evening of Yom Kippur service. We would park in the parking lot. As we parked, one brave member of our family would go, oh, I'm sorry for everything I did this year. And everyone would go, me too, me too, me too, me too. And then we were done, right? And that was our atonement, right? And it became this sort of weird family custom. And as I got older and older, I thought, none of us are atoning. All we're trying to do is we're trying to say, make sure that we've said the right words so that God might go, oh, okay, they're in, they're good, they can last another year. Whereas actually what you're meant to do during this time is really sincerely atone. Really turn to those you've wronged and say, I'm sorry, right? I won't do that again. You can't do that if suddenly on day one you're like, oh, I'm a terrible person. You need a month to stop and think and go, okay, right, where did I go wrong? Who did I wrong? Right? I wronged these people. And there seems to be a connection, which is I seem to behave in this way. So I'm going to need to stop that and change that behavior. And then during the 10 days, then I can atone. Then I can turn to someone and say, in the last month, I've really been working on myself. And I've really realized I'm a terrible person. And I keep doing this to you. And I'm sorry. And I've really made myself aware of it. So that's why Elul exists, to give us that time to really reflect. And I've got to blow my nose, God, tickly nose. Any thoughts or questions so far on the month of Elul?
That whole process, it sounds a lot like therapy, and it also sounds a lot like, if you're familiar with 12-step programs, the 4th step and the 5th step, and then the 8th and 9th, taking your own personal inventory, admitting when you were wrong, and then making amends to people that you've hurt, unless it's going to hurt them or others. So I've always found that parallel fascinating.
There is actually a colleague who's written a book on repentance and the 12-step process, and where they are similar and where they're different. I can't think of the name of the book, but probably worth having a look. It's something like the. Oh, go on, Stephen.
I was just wondering, with like atonement and asking for forgiveness, is there rules? Since there's always rules within if you're not forgiven. Yes,
there are rules. There's actually a lovely movie called Ushpizin. It's an Israeli movie. I really recommend it. It really is an insight into the.
Can you type it, please? So
Thank you.
I can
Yes,
write it
absolutely
down?
right. Absolutely right. Ushpizin. It means guests. The Ushpizin are the guests who we invite to our sukkah. during the festival of Sukkot. It's a gorgeous movie set around the time of Sukkot in the ultra-Orthodox community in Jerusalem. I won't give anything away, except for there's one guy who's asking for forgiveness. And he goes to someone and he asks for forgiveness and the guy says no. And he comes back and he asks for forgiveness, the guy says no. And he comes back again and he says, this is the third time, you have to forgive me. We are obliged to forgive someone who sincerely asks for forgiveness, at least on the third time. If we don't forgive them, then their sin becomes our sin. The problem is, Naomi's like, oh, wow, okay. Right? But the problem is, how do you determine if someone is sincere? Because it's very easy to go, I'm sorry for everything I did. Me too, me too, me too, me too. That's not sincere to Juva, right? But if you see that someone really is really sincere, then we're obliged to forgive them. But what does it mean to be sincere? Because they may sincerely believe that they are atoning, and you can think, I know they're going to do it again. I know they are, because they're not. They think they're sincere, but they're not. Ultimately, forgiveness is a selfish act. Because what it does is it says, I am no longer controlled by what you have done to me. At the same time, that doesn't mean that we become a doormat, that we turn around and say, so do it again, right? We can forgive someone and say, I totally forgive you, and I never want to see you again, right? Because you are harmful to me, or because there can be no connection between us, because the pain was so deep, or the harm that was caused that was so deep. I forgive you for it, but. So forgiveness ultimately is a selfish act. In some sense, it's also a selfless act, because it says to the person, you are not guided by everything that you have done in the past. Some people are, though. Some people are addicted to their own bad behavior. And it's a challenge for us around this time to work out what is sincere and what is not. But forgiveness, just to be clear, forgiveness does not mean letting abusers off the hook. It doesn't mean anything like that at all. In fact, if somebody is violent, if somebody is, there are consequences for that. There should be legal consequences for that, or social consequences for that. But at the same time, what we're doing by saying, I allow you forgiveness, I give you forgiveness, is I'm moving on with my life from that. So in theory, if we believe they are sincere, then we are obliged the third time they ask to grant forgiveness. But as I say, there's a challenge in terms of working out, are they sincere and so on. And some people might be sincere and then fall straight back on really bad habits. Many of us have faced abuse from people, psychological, physical, any kind of abuse from other people. I am not saying that you are obliged to forgive them. I'm not. There are some things which can't be forgiven. Sins between person and person can be, sins between a person and God cannot. So, for example, murder is considered to be a sin between a person and God, not between person and person, because when you take a life, you are taking away the life that God created. That's the kind of thing that actually, who is it, Rabbi Albert Friedlander, I think it was, of blessed memory. He was in Germany and leading a Holocaust Remembrance Day service, and this young German kid came up to him and said, please, I'm sorry on behalf of my people. Can you forgive my people? And he turned around to this young kid and said, good on you, but I can't, because it's not up to me. Because once you kill people, it's not between person and person, it's between a person and God. So, yes, there are rules to forgiveness, but Judaism does not in any way say that you should be a victim. It does not say that you should grant, clemency and you should just give any kind of free ride to abusers. In fact, it may be healthy to turn around and say, I want you no longer in my life. So I'm glad you asked that question, because there is a delicate balancing act. And each situation is unique. If you need to talk to me confidentially about a unique situation that's troubling you, I'm always happy to be here to talk to anyone about it. Great question, thank you. Okay, Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year. Oh, go on.
Quick clarifying question. And I think that the answer is yes. I just want to make sure. We're allowed to forgive before the third time, right?
Oh, yes.
Okay, cool. Just double checking.
Yes. Yes, someone comes
Yeah.
to you and is sincere. If you're not ready for it, you can say no. But if they are sincere and you think, yeah, I can let this go, then yeah, then absolutely. Okay. Rosh Hashanah. Rosh means head. Shana means year. Ha is the. So literally, head the year, head of the year. It's in construct form. It's the first of the month of Tishri. In the Bible, Rosh Hashanah simply means the beginning of the year. It doesn't designate the festival. The festival is actually known as Yom Teruah, the day of blowing the horn, basically. The festival lasts for one day. However, in Rabbinic Judaism, it became 2 days long, as well as many other festivals. It became 2 days long because it's the new moon. So you have to be certain that you've got the right date. What happens if it's cloudy that day? You can't be absolutely certain that it is the new moon. So that's one reason. There actually became another reason, which is that people would declare it was the new moon, and then they would light fires, actually just like, Lord of the Rings and Gondor. Gondor calls for aid, and they have these little beacons, and they would light beacons, and they would go across Israel announcing it's the new month. But some people realized, some heretics essentially realized, we can really mess with the Jews right now, and we're going to light these a day out. And so, just in case of doubt, just in case anyone did anything wrong, Rosh Hashanah became a 2-day festival in the Orthodox. And you'll also see that Pesach becomes 8 days, Shavuot becomes 2 days. These festivals are increased. Where does Rosh Hashanah come from? It very probably comes from Babylon. In Babylon, there was an enthronement festival that was 10 days long. Marduk, the god, was enthroned during that time. Just as in Rosh Hashanah, in the liturgy, we have a lot of references to God as ruler, God as king. And we have the 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Some people see this and say that's outrageous, to say that it came from Babylon, it came from the Jews and this is all us. As I mentioned last time with Pesach, I have no problem with Judaism saying, look at that. They're doing that, an enthronement festival for their God. Why don't we do the same, but we'll do it in a Jewish way? And I actually, as a rabbi, I have no problem with Judaism doing that. Those people are living out in booths when they're collecting their food, their harvest. Why don't we live out in booths for a week and make a religious thing out of it? So we'll call the festival Sukkot, meaning booths. Those people are eating this at this time. Why don't we do that and give it special significance? I don't have a problem with that. Judaism has always adapted to the time. So it's very likely, I think, that it is, in fact, based on an old Babylonian festival. So in rabbinic literature, there are 4 different New Years. I already gave away what they are. Okay. Let's read a little about the theme, though, of Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is the day when all humanity is judged. Rabbi Eliezer said the world was created in Tishri. In other words, Rosh Hashanah is the birthday of the world. And we actually do have a song. Let's Hayom Harat Olam. Today is the birthday of the world. Hayom Harat Olam. And so on, okay? Today is the birthday of the world. Some people say Rosh Hashanah is the birthday of the world. Rabbi Joshua says, no, the world was created in Nisan. And so this is the 6th month. Well, the Rosh Hashanah liturgy, however, tends to follow Rabbi Eliezer and says the world was created in Tishri. So what that does is that connects creation and judgment together. Just being careful, judgment isn't necessarily a bad thing. Judgment is allowing us, if you know that you are being judged, it gives you the opportunity to turn around and say, I need to actually reflect on what I am doing. The Hebrew for prayer, lehit palel, to pray. Lehit palel means to judge oneself, to reflect on oneself. Prayer is always a form of judgment. Am I doing this right? Am I really celebrating today? Am I in awe of the world around me? So judgment isn't necessarily a court, although that is the theme that is used in Rosh Hashanah liturgy. Judgment can be time for reflection, time for contemplation. So one opinion says, on Rosh Hashanah, heaven assigns to a person how much they will earn in the coming year. The problem with this, which is not often explained in liturgy, this idea, the problem with this is it starts to impinge on free will. And it also victim blames a lot. Well, if you're poor, that's because God determined that you were poor. Maybe tomorrow you'll be rich, but it was determined by God. Now, you can turn around and say, well, that's a bit difficult. You could say, why would God determine that I should be poor? And the response, a traditional response would be, because you need to be for your own personal growth and development. Well, that person is rich, and it's totally out of your hands. It's an interesting difference, I guess, to the sort of American dream, which we know is a fiction, which is if you work hard enough, you can become rich. It's like, no, you probably need actually to be born in the right society and to have inherited wealth and so on. This at least says it's out of your hands. And so for some people, that's a bit challenging. We tend not to focus on that. What we do focus on is the idea of this metaphor here, of the 3 books. 3 books are opened on Rosh Hashanah. One for the completely righteous, one for the completely wicked, and one for average people. The completely righteous are immediately inscribed in the book of life. The completely wicked are immediately inscribed in the book of death. Average people, that's most of us, are kept in suspension from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur. If they deserve well, they're inscribed in the book of life. If they do not deserve well, they are inscribed in the book of death. So, let me explain this first, where it says RH16b. I've actually put a lot of these different sort of sources down. So I actually want to show you, whenever you have, let's say 16a or 16b, whenever you have a text like that, that means it's Talmud. Almost certainly Babylonian Talmud. Let me write this, Babylonian Talmud, aka the Bavli, right? If you see something 16a or 16b, it's Babylonian Talmud. Jerusalem Talmud has C and D, we won't go into that. If you see here where it says RH32, that's going to be Mishnah. So Mishnah is, let me write that down. So Mishnah, as I mentioned last time, is written around 200 of the Common Era. Talmud is written around 550 of the Common Era, around. So a Mishnah source, if it's not a biblical source, a Mishnah source will have a number, colon, number. Talmud will have a number followed by A or B. And then you normally have a little bit of a summary. So RH32 means it's from the Mishnah, tractate Rosh Hashanah, chapter 3, Mishnah 2. If you have RH16b, that means it's from Talmud, tractate Rosh Hashanah, page 16b. Okay, That's just a little thing for references as you're seeing all these weird numbers appearing. Any opening thoughts about this idea? 3 books are opened on Rosh Hashanah. One for the completely righteous, one for the completely wicked, and one for average people. Completely righteous are immediately inscribed in the book of life. That means they will live for the rest of the year. The completely wicked are immediately inscribed in the book of death. That means they will die at some point this year. Average people are kept in suspension from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur. If they deserve well, they're inscribed in the book of life. If they don't deserve well, they're inscribed in the book of death. So if they atone, basically, during Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, then they're going to live through the year. If they don't atone well, then they will die at some point during the year. Anyone want to share some thoughts, honest reactions to that text?
Well, at some point, everyone has to die. So does that make that year that you die, that you're a bad person?
Okay, any other thoughts? Do you like it?
just-
Do you like it? Oh, Levi.
It seems really blatantly false to me. Like, my first reaction is this is just not how it works. And also, I don't love the use of death as punishment. It feels very like death penalty-ish. And I'm pretty anti-death penalty under like every circumstance. So it just immediately is like shouldn't be a punishment. Death is just part of living. There's like an interesting text in one of the books by Rabbi Abraham Heschel about how death is not evil because death is part of being alive. And so like it can't be considered evil because it's not an evil that's done to us. It's just something that happens by nature of our nature. So it seems interesting to me that there would be a core tenement that uses death as punishment.
Nice, thank you. I think otherwise summarized as the circle of life. Yes, indeed, thank you.
Yeah, so
Steve.
mine was similar with Cindy there. So does it just mean you were a bad person that year? But also just curious with the Book of Suspension, is that kind of where the thought of like purgatory potentially came from, or other way around? I don't know. It kind of sounds more upon that nature for that time period.
So Judaism picked up this notion of Gehinnom. Whoops. Gehinnom. Some people actually write it Gehinnom, right? Gehinnom. It literally means the valley of Hinnom. You had a place, you have Jerusalem, which is the highest place around, and it's on a hill, basically. Then as you go down, at the bottom you had this valley of Hinnom. And according to rabbinic literature, this was the center of the universe. Yeah, right. Thank you, Crystal. Come to that, right? So this is the center of the universe, the highest, the holiest place. And then right at the bottom, you had idolaters who were worshipping idols in the valley of Hinnom. And so the rabbis took this and said, actually, just as on earth, so beyond earth. So that there is a very positive place and a very negative place. Sorry, I should have taken my allergy tablets today. So they came up with the idea of reward and punishment in an afterlife, which clearly comes from Hellenism, which wasn't in Torah at all. And I mean, there are vague references that you could say refer to afterlife. We'll look at this in our course and on our session on life, death, and beyond death. But essentially, they turned around and said, if God is just, then everything must happen justly. So what that means is, good people, if a good person dies, then that must be because they're now going to heaven, which is even better than earth. And if a bad person lives for ages and ages on this world and seems to be succeeding, that's because they're going to have a terrible afterlife in Gehinnom. The absolute worst people, just their souls are destroyed immediately. They don't even get to Gehinnom. Gehinnom becomes purgatory, the cleansing place. and you are cleansed by fire. I mean, again, picking up from all these other, societies, you are cleansed by fire for up to 11 months, for up to a year, for up to a year. That is why we say the mourner's Kaddish for 11 months. Because the mourner's Kaddish, it is said, when somebody dies, you recite the mourner's Kaddish. Let me type that out. Kaddish. The mourner's Kaddish is the prayer that we recite when somebody dies. It is said that the mourner's Kaddish cools the flames of Gehinnom for those who are there. Right? So we recite mourner's Kaddish for 11 months, not for 12 months. If we said mourner's Kaddish for 12 months, what we'd be saying is, this person who we remember was a really bad person. Not the worst, they weren't Hitler, but they were so bad that they had to stay in Gehinnom for 12 months. So we're going to assume that they weren't terrible, so we're going to cut it off a bit, and we're just going to say it for 11 months. It's a very odd custom. So this idea of the book of in between does touch on this theme of being in between. Judaism, as I wrote in my rabbinic thesis, is very polarized. Day, night, kosher, unkosher, holy, profane, and so on. So righteous or not righteous, basically. Righteous or wicked. So you got to make your choice. Are you good or are you bad? But so when Harold Kushner's book, it's Kushner, Harold Kushner's book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, came out, I guess, the 1980s, I think it was. And it was like in the bathroom of every Jew in England. It was really bizarre. Like every Jew just goes and sits down. This is before we had phones. What were you going to do on the toilet? You're going to sit and read, right? And it was like every Jewish household had a copy of When Bad Things Happen to Good People. A lot of people found a lot of comfort from that book. A lot of rabbis turned around and said, this really isn't Judaism anymore, actually. You've kind of gone beyond. And so it's actually very interesting because now a lot of Reform rabbis say, no, this actually is a very healthy expression of Judaism. So we can come to that when we come back to life and death and so on. But I think it's a moving book, but it's a very challenging, different theology. It's Kushner, Harold Kushner. He also wrote a book, it was actually really unfortunate. He wrote a book called Who Needs God? And the reason that's unfortunate is because the spine says, who needs God? Harold Kushner. So that doesn't look good on a bookshelf. Anyway, this text that I've shared, this text from Rosh Hashanah 16b, which means it's from the Talmud, our liturgy is based around it. Our High Holy Day liturgy is based around it. And you have all indicated, or those who have spoken on it, have indicated all of the problems with it. It victim blames. I mean, we just, whenever there's a bereavement, whenever somebody dies, you go, oh, well, they didn't atone properly. It's their fault. So, no, it isn't. Somebody drove a car into them, right? It was the car driver's fault. You go, no. If they had atoned properly, they wouldn't have been there. Or they would have survived or something. It totally victim blames. And it raises deep theological questions like the one, I think it was Crystal who wrote, so when babies die, does that mean that they didn't atone? It doesn't actually, because you become liable once you're an adult. Once you turn 13, then it becomes a little bit different. But nonetheless, everybody's going to die at some point, right? So does that mean when you reach 95 years old, right, you've been a totally righteous person all your life, and then you die at 95, and people go, well, you must have been pretty bad in the old people's home, right? I mean, just theologically, I understand why it was comforting for some people, because if nothing else, it pushes you to atone. I've got to do this so that I can live, because I want to live. I want to do these things, so I have to atone. I get that. But the theological consequences, the sociological consequences are enormous. So even though this is like the core metaphor of the High Holy Days, you will find we move away from it at Temple Beth Shalom and in many Reformed communities quite profoundly, actually, because there's so many issues with it. So yes, but what do you think of this?
It makes me think of that. It makes me think of the group, the Naturi Karta, where like the ultimate flip side of that is you have a group of Jews who say that the Shoah is Jews' fault for doing something that they weren't supposed to do, which is like horrific. And if it was a non-Jew, it would be like really rampant anti-Semitism. But like you have this group of Jews who say that it's Jewish people's fault for the Shoah.
When I was in Aish Torah in Jerusalem 20 years ago, I was learning from a guy called Tzvi, who was teaching us about the mitzvot. And he was talking about essentially blame and, if you don't do this, then this. And I said, whoa, I said, I'm really sorry. Sounds like you just blamed Jews for the Holocaust. And he said, no, I'm not blaming all Jews for the Holocaust. But if Jews had been devout, and if they hadn't have strayed through the reform movement that formed, then God's people would never have been abandoned by God and the Shoah. So I said, okay, so you're not blaming all Jews for the Holocaust, you're blaming Reform Jews for the Holocaust. He said, look, it's not my place to assign blame. I was like, yeah, you just did. You definitely just did, right? Of course, it becomes really angry, judgmental theology, but judgmental in a totally wrong way. Not judgmental in the sense of judging ourselves and trying to work out, do we go towards the side of God's mercy or God's justice, as I spoke about this morning. It becomes, you died, your fault, right? You can't, that's the natural corollary of that theology. So yeah, it becomes extremely problematic. So even though it's in the Machzor, let me write that down. So Siddur equals daily prayer book. Machzor equals High Holy Day prayer book. Interesting, by the way, in England, we would always write High Holy Day like that. And when I came here and I wrote that, they said, it's not a holiday. I said, it is. I said, that's literally what Holy Day means, holiday, right? And they said, no, but we don't write High Holiday. We call it High Holy Day. Okay. But that's how they write it in England, High Holy Day. Okay, the shofar I've mentioned. I blown the shofar. Laws and customs of Rosh Hashanah. On the first night of Rosh Hashanah, it's customary to greet your friends with, may you be inscribed for a good year, right? That comes back to that metaphor. What you will find a lot of other people will say instead is just Shana Tova. Shana means year, Tova means good. So Shana Tova means have a good year. So you might hear people say in Hebrew, may you be inscribed for a good life. You may actually just have people come up to you and say, Shana Tova, have a good year. That's all we can ask for. They're basically saying the same thing. It's just the first one specifically focuses on that metaphor of the book of life, which means the book of death as well. The other one just says, I just hope you have a good year. I hope you make it through the year. I hope it's good for you. There is a custom of dipping a piece of bread, interesting, over which grace has been recited. In other words, always say motzi when you're eating bread, into honey as a token of a sweet new year. For the same reason, a piece of apple is sometimes dipped into honey and saying a sweet new year. Oh, that should not be nuts. That should be nuts. There you go. We say the blessing for the apple, Borei Peri Ha'etz, and then we say, may it be your will, Eternal One, our God and God of our ancestors, to renew us to a good and sweet year. Apples and honey, very, very common for Rosh Hashanah. Can also be challah and honey. There was actually a custom for a while in our temple that was totally unique. Wendy used to, before Wendy was here, it was Dorothea. Dorothea went to Whole Foods and said, we need special challah for Rosh Hashanah, please. Challah, let me just write that down. Challah. Challah is the special kind of bread. On Shabbat, it is braided. I would say plaited. It's braided. On Rosh Hashanah, it's shaped in a circle, like the year that goes round. She said, we need challah and apples and honey. Or we need challah and apples in particular. What they heard was apples in challah. And so our temple used to have a special apple challah that was made for us once a year by Whole Foods, and there would be a number of them, and you tear it open, and there'd be apples and honey and everything inside, and it was awesome. And until it was amazing, until Whole Foods turned around and was like, "Why are we doing this really ridiculous thing for once a year? Can't they just have bread and apples and honey like everyone else?" And so they actually stopped it. But for a while, when I came here, it was this awesome thing of apple challah. So there was a nice combination. So we dip to as a metaphor for having a sweet new year. Okay, what else do we have? So nuts shouldn't be eaten on Rosh Hashanah. This is an interesting halakha because they produce phlegm and make it more difficult to recite the prayers of the day. And also because the numerical value for nut, egoz, is the same as that for sin, chet. What am I talking about here? What I'm talking about here is something called gematria. Gematria is where every letter has a number. So in the English language, you would say A is 1, B is 2, C is 3, D is 4, and so on. You have the same thing in Hebrew. Aleph is 1, Bet is 2, Gimel is 3, and so on. Once you get to 10, though, you've got, once you get to 10, you go into tens, and then you even go into hundreds. And so one really fun rabbinic thing is taking the letters of one word, counting the numerical value of the letters, and then trying to work out that is the same as this. So they realized that the Hebrew for nut has the same numerical value as the Hebrew for sin. Therefore, don't eat nuts on Rosh Hashanah because they'll lead you to sin. Okay? Now, that seems to have, my guess is somebody prominent probably ate nuts on Rosh Hashanah, had an allergic reaction, and everyone's like, we should not do that anymore. But you make something rabbinic out of it. Gematria is a lot of fun. Some people take gematria way too seriously, and say you have to avoid this because it leads to this and so on, in a much more painful, superstitious way. I think it's an interesting thing. We don't eat nuts because it comes to the same as sin. For some people, instead of baking the round challah, the sort of spiral challah, they'll bake challah in a ladder shape to symbolize the fortunes of people in the year ahead. Some people, their fortunes go up. Some people, their fortunes will go down. Like numerology. Yeah, it's absolutely like numerology. You have to be really careful with this kind of thing. I keep seeing there's a book in the temple. We're trying to sell a lot of the old books that we weren't using in the library. And the Bible Code by Michael Drozen keeps appearing, and I keep trying to hide it. I don't want to throw it out, but I might. Because it's so nonsensical. Oh, if you find these letters, in this number skip, then you have this prophecy of what will happen in the future. Like, no, statistically, if you have a giant text with 200,000 letters in it, you're going to find secret codes. So it's really not saying much. So I think numerology is a fun rabbinic thing, although some people take it very seriously, mystically. Okay, what else have we got? Let's have a look quickly. Okay, tashlich. I think I mentioned tashlich last week. Tashlich comes from the verb shalach, which means to send, right? To send out. On Yom Kippur, one of the customs was to have 2 goats in the Torah. Scapegoats, that's where the phrase scapegoat comes from. You would have one goat that would be sent to Azazel. Now, who or what is Azazel? Some people say that Azazel means the wilderness. Some people think Azazel is the name of a demon. Nobody knows. And so, depending on your interpretation, that's fine. One goat is slaughtered, one goat is sent to Azazel. Out, I read it as out into the wilderness. The priest takes the sins of the people lays his hands on the goat and says, "You got them now," and off the goat goes, so that the sins of the people are sent away. What is the potential problem with putting your sins on a goat and sending it out into the wilderness? Anyone? What's the potential problem?
What if it comes back?
What if it comes back? That's what Omi was going to say, right? What if it comes back? Then you've got a big problem. So then the rabbis in the Mishnah said, okay, we're actually going to do this slightly differently. We're going to send it into the wilderness and we're going to have a big party, basically. And we're going to walk this goat out into the wilderness to a cliff and push it off. Right? It's not coming back now, is it? Right? Then you have the rabbi say, okay, but what if it gets stuck halfway down? Okay, this is so rabbinic. Like, what if the goat comes back? Oh, okay, you're right. So we're going to have to take it and push it off a cliff. Right? Okay, but what if the goat gets stuck halfway down and so on? We don't really need to explore that much more. But the idea of the scapegoat is it would take people's sins away. In the Middle Ages, late Middle Ages, so I think we're talking 1500s, 1600s, people started saying, we want something. We can't do this ritual because the temple hasn't been standing for 1,500 years. So they said, how about we cast away our sins by throwing it into running water? And so we're going to put our sins on bread or anything like that and cast it into running water. So they created this service called tashlich, the casting off, the sending away. And the rabbis hated it. They hated this custom. You can't do that. You can't carry bread in public on the festival of Rosh Hashanah. That's breaking festival law of carrying in public. You can't do that. And you're not high priests and you can't do it anyway. And they hated the custom for years. And the people kept doing it. And it's actually a lovely custom. If you have running water, if you don't live in the high desert. What Temple Beth Shalom used to do was deeply depressing, actually. If you go out into the back, there is a fish pond, like a plastic fish pond. And we used to fill the fish pond and just chuck bread in it. And then we would basically turn the fish pond over. And it was this really depressing thing of everyone gathering around this like plastic container, like, I guess, there's my sins. They're not really casting away. They're just kind of floating in front of me. Right? So then what we did was we actually approached the mayor and said, do you think it's possible to turn on the Santa Fe River for an hour on Rosh Hashanah so that we can cast our sins? Because it has to be a reliable thing. Sometimes it would be running, sometimes it wouldn't. So for a few years, we actually did have the river running. And all the Jewish communities would descend at a certain time, and so that we could all have this running water. And quite fairly, they've turned around in the last few years and said, that's never happening again, right? We can't afford the water. We let it go when it builds up to a certain time. We can't just let the water run for the Jews. And we're like, yeah, but it's really good for people downstream. But it's totally fair. So actually what Cantaliana did was she created a new ritual where we're actually, instead of casting away bread into water, we're casting bird seed. And so that the birds come and take it away, as opposed to casting it into water where traditionally the fish take it away. I used to do tashlich in Bournemouth at the seaside. And tashlich at the seaside is gorgeous and has this wonderful metaphor. Because what happens when you throw your sins into seawater, right? If you get the wave brings it back. And it reminds you, it's actually quite hard to throw your sins away. And then the seagulls will come down and you'll be like, take my sins, please, right? It's actually quite lovely by the seaside because you actually can stand in the sea if you really want it to, if you really want your sins to go away, you've got to go a little bit in and really chuck them away. Tashlich is a lovely service, which the rabbis eventually realized we can't fight this. So let's create some liturgy, let's create some prayers, and brought it into everyday practice every year practice for Rosh Hashanah. So it's that casting off of sins, that service, in the afternoon of Rosh Hashanah. It's actually, I think, a lovely service. Okay, I think, yep, that's everything in my handout. So any questions about Elul, the Shofar, Rosh Hashanah, Tashlich, any atonement, repentance, forgiveness, ask it all, basically. Oh, Selichot. Thank you, Lisa. You asked me specifically to do Selichot, and I totally forgot. Okay. Selichot are prayers of pardon. We actually recite Selichot quite often, but the Selichot service itself is a service full of prayers for pardon. It happens on the Saturday night before Rosh Hashanah. Traditionally, Selichot happens late at night, around midnight. But in a communal setting like ours, that's just not going to happen. So we actually have our Selichot service, I think, at like 7 o'clock. It happens on the Saturday night before Rosh Hashanah, unless Rosh Hashanah is on a Sunday or Monday, in which case that's not enough time. So then it falls a week beforehand, a week and a few days beforehand. I actually think Selichot is a lovely service because you've gone through the month of Elul, or most of the month of Elul. You're really preparing yourselves, and then you start hearing some of the High Holy Day liturgy itself. So you're bringing some of those prayers in. You're starting to sing some of the tunes. We're singing in a minor key. We're very depressed because we're Jewish. It really brings us into that sense, that sound, that hearing of right, we're there. We're nearly there now. And on Selichot, we change the whites. So we have, we'll come to you in a minute, Steve. We have Torah covers, and some communities have ark cloths that are dark and so on. Some communities have a cloth that goes over the reading desk, and they are all changed for the whites during the Selichot service. And that is lovely. You bring out every Torah scroll, and you undress it, and then dress it in its whites, and then put it back. And that just shows us if the Torah scrolls can change, we can change. Right? I mean, it's a bit easier to change a Torah scroll than it is to change a person, to change behavior. But it's a metaphor for everything is changing now. We're trying to purify ourselves, white being seen as the color of purity, essentially. There's interesting questions about whiteness being clear and pure and so on. It's very interesting to have had that raised in the last few years. It's like, well, of course white is, because, it's clean. It's like, well, black could be clean, blue could be clean, any of these colors could be clean, actually. So it's an interesting assumption that white becomes the color of purity. But I think it's a very powerful evening service. This year, some of our liturgy, our Selichot liturgies, has been written by our members. I've had 3 liturgical submissions so far, one from someone who is here. For me, it's actually very powerful to have, this is something we started 2 years ago, 3 years ago. Wow, 3 years ago. No, it can't be right. 2 years ago. We started it 2 years ago for Rosh Hashanah, because as we were here online for High Holy Day services, I wanted people to connect. And so I said, I need you to help write High Holy Day liturgy. And we put it in the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur service. And then we did it for Pesach, which followed. And then we did it again for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And then we did it again for Pesach. And now we're doing it not for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, but for Selichot. And what I'm going to do is I am eventually going to compile all of this liturgy and actually probably get it published, because the liturgy from our members is really, really good. Really good. So we actually had some sessions on Tichinas and Piyutim, on how to write these certain kinds of liturgical poetry. So this Selichot is not just your traditional liturgy, it's also going to include member liturgy, so that our voice is part of that ever-evolving liturgical tradition. Steve?
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted you to completely finish that thought, so I did the hand raising. So I wanted to kind of go back to Tashlik, when you said the rabbis decided, like, no, we have to do something about it. But if it's not in Talmud, where is that now then being put?
Okay.
So that's usually where you go back to and point to is Talmud. But with Tashlik, you're saying it's not there, so it's now a more modern thing.
Right. So where does rabbinic authority come from? Essentially, it comes from what is known as samicha, which is translated nowadays as ordination. Samach means to lay your hands. So semicha is the laying of hands from one rabbi to another. So Rabbi Simon Francis gave me semicha, and maybe at some point in my life I will give someone semicha. And so the idea is that it's inherent in that chain, that a rabbi gives semicha to someone who they know can continue the chain of rabbinic authority. In the Orthodox community, semicha is considered to be going all the way back to Moses, because Moses lays his hands on Joshua. And so basically anyone who has semicha essentially has that authority. And so in the Orthodox community, anything that a rabbi says, halachically speaking, was passed down from Moses. They may not have been revealed until the year 2022, but Moses said it, it just wasn't written down or expressed yet. Now you can say, well, that's ridiculous, because how can that be? Because that's way too many things. You say, well, because it's in the derived principles. So Moses passed down the principles, and the principles were adhered to, and therefore when a rabbi says this, if they adhere to those principles, Moses basically said it. So yes, you look in the Mishnah. First you look in Torah. There are two types of Jewish law, essentially. There is D'Oraita, which is Torah law, and there is D'Rabbanan. Both these phrases, D'Oraita and D'Rabbanan, are in Aramaic, not in Hebrew. D'Rabbanan is rabbinic law. Torah law supersedes rabbinic law, except for the times when rabbinic law supersedes Torah law, obviously. You go to Torah law first. What does the Torah say? If the Torah needs clarification, you go to rabbinic law. Rabbinic law is expressed in the Mishnah, as we've seen, the Mishnah, then the Talmud, but then also codes, codified halachic literature. So there is more halakha, there's more Jewish law in in the codes. So that Maimonides wrote the Mishnah Torah. He said, this is the code of Jewish law. And then you have the Shulchan Aruch and other codes of Jewish law. And they say, this is what you must do and how you must do it. So you don't have to always go to Talmud. First you go to Torah. Actually, I should have written Torah to Mishnah to Talmud to codes. That's actually how I should have written it. Torah to Mishnah to Talmud to codes. So what's the authority? The authority is in the rabbis themselves. They usually will turn around and say, because this text says this and this text says this, therefore we do this. Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. Okay, any other questions, thoughts, comments even? Naomi?
Yeah. I'm curious about how this is like personal for you, like the spirit of this, because we have, the laws of it. And then somebody mentioned before about therapy, and I'm a therapist. And so I was just thinking about how beneficial it is for us to forgive ourselves or to make peace with things. And so I was just thinking about that, because it's been really helpful for me in some of your sermons when you get personal, of what's the layer beneath like these laws? Like, how does that, what is that for you in your life?
I really appreciate you asking that question, because very often when I teach the introduction to Judaism, I'm like, this is the law, and this is the law, and this is the law, and these are the rules, and this is what we do. And that's not what Judaism is about. The laws form a framework for a connection between us and each other, and us and God, and us to our truest selves. Interesting. Yesterday, someone was like, we really appreciate when you're vulnerable, and we'd like you to be more vulnerable. I was like, okay. What does it mean? It's interesting, actually. I was looking through my old posts on the rabbinic Facebook group, because of course rabbis have a Facebook group. 2 years ago, I wrote that was the least spiritual Rosh Hashanah I have ever had in my life, because I was in the sanctuary by myself. There was nobody else there, and I was talking to a computer screen, and I couldn't hear anyone. And I was letting people in because we hadn't thought about maybe someone else should be letting people in. So while I'm leading the prayers, who's coming in? Right, I'll let them in. And every time I let someone in while one of the choir videos was playing, it would stop the choir video. So I'd have to quickly click on that again. And then I had to remember, right, don't let them in. So they're going to have to wait while the choir video is playing and so on. And I finished Rosh Hashanah. By Yom Kippur, I said, somebody's got to let other people in because this is crazy. We finished Yom Kippur and I literally finished the service, turned it off, like pressed end for the Zoom meeting because it was all on Zoom. And I just burst into tears. Because I was like, this was the worst. This was absolutely worst. And Wendy actually came in and said, I get it, you're crying. It was exhausting. I was like, that's not why I'm crying, right? I'm crying because that was terrible. Compare that with a few years before when I was becoming aware of behaviors in myself that had been long in myself that actually were very harmful to myself and to others around me. And it was really interesting. That was a service where we were all together and people turned around afterwards and said something was different about that service. And I don't know what it was. And only I knew what it was, which was I was going through a very profound experience of teshuvah. Of, wow, I'm not the person I thought I was, and I can be a much better person. And I know I can. And so this is the moment where I have this, and coming to that realization and having a moment. I gave a sermon, I don't remember how many years ago, about it's not about you, right? The High Holy Days are not about you. They're about someone in the community who's going to have a moment, right? And they're going to have a moment only because we're gathered together, right? We can't all live at Sinai and have that amazing moment every time we go to services. If you think you're going to leave services really disappointed. But when you have 300-400 people gathered in a room, maybe 200 people gathered in a room, there might be one person who, because of that community, just like, oh, this is it. This is my moment. And I had that during that service. I had an experience of profound, it's going to be okay. And it was life-changing for me. And apparently everyone saw it without seeing it. So what does it mean spiritually, the High Holy Days? It means an opportunity to become the best you and to actually, there's a custom, it says that we should atone one day before our death. The rabbi says this, and so his students respond and say, so you know when you're going to die? He says, no, that's why you should atone today. And you should atone every day, because you never know, right? But we don't. We don't spend our lives in atonement. We can try, right? And that's what prayer should be, to say, how can I be a better person today? What do I need to do today? What wrongs do I need to address today? We can try, but usually it becomes the High Holy Day rush. And so what does Rosh Hashanah mean? It means a new start. It means a chance to say, however bad a person I think I am, however convinced of my righteousness I have become, I can strip that away and say, you know what? I can be better than this. And I can have much better relationships with my loved ones, with my community, with everyone around me. I was a very different person when I came here, actually. People who've been here for 8 years will say, right, it was a jerk when he came here, right? And that's okay, right? I'm okay with that because Temple Beth Shalom gave me the opportunity to become a different person. It's the old Family Guy scene of, that cut scene. Did I mention this last week? It's the old cut scene from Family Guy. They have these 10-second clips, and there's a guy looking out onto this gorgeous sunset surrounded by, Santa Fe style buildings. And Peter Griffin turns to him and says, isn't the Santa Fe sunset wonderful? And the guy goes, yes, it is. And Peter says, did you have a public breakdown in another community elsewhere? He goes, yes, I did. And that's it, right? I was like, wow, I feel called out, right? I was like, good grief. Thank you, Peter Griffin. But why do people move to Santa Fe? Because it gives them a chance to really focus on the spiritual, actually, to really explore that. So it shouldn't be, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur shouldn't be about clamoring to get into the book of life. You shouldn't be like, please, 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 God, I'll be a better person. Please, right? Please give me some more, right? It shouldn't be about that. It shouldn't be servants begging to a master, like, please, let me in again. Let me in the club. I'll be good this time. It should be about teshuvah. It should be about real return to the self. Like, who am I? What is the best me that I can be? And that's a tough question, actually. And how do I connect to others? And how do I connect to God? And all of that, I think for me, I think it's very exciting. Spiritually, can be deeply moving and transformative, essentially. If the high holy days aren't transformative, if you are the same person, I always say this of any prayer, if you are the same person after your prayer than you were before your prayer, you didn't pray. You recited words. And in some rabbinic tradition, that's fine. You say the words and you spoken the holy tongue, so that's fine, you've prayed. But if prayer is reflective, you have to be a different person after your prayer. And the high holy days are full of prayers, just absolutely full of prayers. I'll share one thing, just to answer Becky's question, Torah to Mishnah to Talmud to Codes. So my rabbi, Simon Francis of blessed memory, I sat down with him. I'm actually going to share, this is a fascinating story that relates to this thing. I'm 16 years old, maybe. Yeah, I think probably 16 years old. Not a normal 16-year-old, going to his rabbi to discuss theology. And I go to Simon, Rabbi Simon, before Rosh Hashanah and say, Simon, I've got a problem. The problem is that I don't believe in the book of life. Now, Simon Francis, to give you context for this impression, Simon Francis was Scottish Greek, okay? And this is an absolutely faithful impression. Simon Francis always spoke his mind. There was something actually very refreshing about a rabbi who was just like, I like this, I don't like this, and so on, right? So I'm 16-year-old sitting in Rabbi Simon Francis' office, and I said to him, Simon, I've got a problem, because I don't believe there's a book of life, and I don't believe there's a book of death. And he said to me, what are you talking about, Neil? He said, of course there's a book of life. As I know, Simon, no, there's no actual book of life. And he goes, of course there's a book of life, Neil. I was like, no, Simon, it's a metaphor, right? I get it, it's a metaphor, right? But I don't like the metaphor. So there's no actual book of life. He gets really angry. He's like, of course there's a fucking book of life, Neil. I'm like, oh my God, right? What is happening here, right? Why is this Reform rabbi, A, cursing at me, right? B, like insisting that there's a book of life. And I said, I don't know what to do with this, Simon. He says, what are you going to do during the high holidays? So I said, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to bring my machzor. I'm going to bring the prayer book. And I'm also going to bring Musar, Jewish self-improvement stuff. And when the liturgy speaks to me, I'm going to pray the liturgy. And when the liturgy doesn't speak to me, I'm going to pull out the Musar and I'm going to work on myself. And he said, you are going to have the most meaningful high holy days of anybody in our synagogue. And that for me was a really important moment. I mean, I'm a 16-year-old kid. I was like, oh, I think I'm getting it. I think I'm starting to, right? This is what it's about. You're not meant to be in shul. You're not meant to be in services bored, right? You're not meant to be like, I'm singing it because I have to, right? If you don't mean it, don't pray it. That's actually one of the brilliant things about Mishkan Tefillah. I have problems with Mishkan Tefillah. I have problems with it skipping a lot of things. But what it does, as a matter of course, is it has the prayers on one side and then reflective readings on the other side, right? And we have that during the Shabbat liturgy, and we have that especially on the High Holy Days liturgy. It's done in different colors, so you can see this is a study passage. That's really exciting. So if you don't like that liturgy, go to the next page, study something else, do something else. That's how you get a spiritual experience on the High Holy Days. Not sitting there going, I got 2 hours. right? I'm going to sit here, I'm going to be a good Jew, I'm going to do my annual thing, and then I'm done, right? It's got to be about changing yourself. So now I've shared the story of Simon Francis, a blessed memory as well. Great question, thank you. We got 10 minutes or so. Father Anne.
Yes, I have a thought that I'd like you to comment on. Just thinking about this idea, you're punished because you didn't atone for it. And thinking about historical things that happened in ancient times. So, I'm wondering about, was it a way that the people tried to gain some control because they were such a small people and these massive empires were coming in and conquering them over and over and over again, really, for centuries. And I guess with the Exodus, God is so powerful that God led people to liberation, and sort of maybe thinking of the power of the empire coming in as being associated with God because God is so powerful. And it's like a collective way for people to try to stay safe or something. Like you kind of internalize it because you really don't have a lot of control against these massive imperial powers. So I don't know, that's kind of what I was thinking about as a way that might have taken root early on.
One of the things that I have learned over the 17 years of the rabbinate is that most people believe that they are in control of their own lives, and actually most of us aren't. And so we set up rules and we set up theology that justifies our belief that we're in control. But actually, there was a member of our community who had a heart attack last week after doing exercise, which proves my point that exercise is bad for you. He exercised and then he had a heart attack. But what do people say? They say, if you do this, if you do exercise, then you'll be healthier, right? There may be a trend, right? That may be true, but actually, you never know, right? There was a chap called, thankfully that person is okay, by the way, they're absolutely fine. It was a minor heart attack. There was a man called Peter in my community back in London when I was a student rabbi. He was going to cure polio. He was working on distributing polio vaccines for free around the world, and he would have helped eradicate polio. He was walking with his family in the woods one day, had a brain aneurysm and died instantly. And because of the way that he was central to his work, it unraveled, and that's why polio still exists. You never know. And so people try to explain to give a sense of control. So I do think that is part of this idea of the 3 books. The book of Job, however, very clearly turns around and says that's total nonsense, right? Sometimes bad things happen to good people. And all of his friends turn around to Job, his companions turn around to Job and say, it must be because you're a bad person. Job, throughout the book, says, no, it isn't. Right? And then God appears at the end of the book, spoilers, God appears at the end of the book and says, no, it's just because, that's it. Because you don't know, and I have a reason, and you don't know it, and that's it. Stop trying to make these rules. So yeah, that may be part of it. At the same time, I will add, as I typed while you were speaking, this concept of Kiddush Hashem, sanctification of the divine name. The Torah quite clearly says that, and Tanakh quite clearly says, if you do bad, I will bring foreign nations against you, but there will be a surviving people. However, then because you end up victim blaming, this concept of Kiddush Hashem really developed, which is people who die, for example, people at Masada, who die because of the Romans, they die to sanctify God's name. They become martyrs. So they become better than any of us, actually, because they die as opposed to choosing to convert or anything like that. So there's a bit of a balance between that sort of victim blaming and then turning around and saying those victims are actually better than all of us. Levi had a hand up first, then Cindy, I think. Oh, you got to unmute.
Oops. When you were sharing that story, Rabbi, about your rabbi, I was thinking about Rosh Hashanah 2018. I was living with friends of mine who are gay Jews who were raised Orthodox. And this was before I had any like understanding of myself with Jewish identity. And my friend Yehuda asked me to go with him to burn pieces of bread. And he wanted to do it at an Orthodox shul because he still very much lived in that world. And sort of let me know in advance, like, hey, don't let him know that you're gay, because that's not a safe thing in many Orthodox communities. And we went and we didn't say anything, and were very clearly read as gay by the people who were there, and there was judgment and all that jazz. And afterwards we were walking and we were going to Whole Foods to go to the bakery to get all the sweet things that we were going to eat on Rosh Hashanah. And I was like, so how are you feeling? And he said, oh, I feel like shit. Because he just got reminded of this really abusive upbringing that he had. And then that Rosh Hashanah, he and his husband went to his parents' house for Rosh Hashanah. And because they're both men, even though they're married, they weren't allowed to sleep in the same room. And like, it was just awful. And I was talking to him about it afterwards, because I was also just fresh out of my own abusive relationship with the Christian church. And I was talking to him about it. And I was like, why do you do this, right? Like, if it's supposed to make you feel like you're casting off your sin, why are you revisiting these communities that are just reminding you of it? Do you feel like you've actually changed or released anything? Or do you just feel awful? And he said, well, no, I mean, I still feel terrible, but it's what I'm supposed to do. It's Rosh Hashanah, this is what you're supposed to do. And then, Rabbi, you know that I've told you several times that there's very little in the story of Abraham that I like. That like pretty much everything Abraham does, I sort of hate, at least a little bit. And I'm thinking about Abraham taking Isaac up, right? And it's like, well, God is telling him to do it. And regardless of whether or not that's what actually happened within the story in the Torah, that's what happened. And I'm like, but this is a bad dude doing bad things that presumably he feels pretty bad about. And then when they get back and his wife, Sarah, finds out what happened, she either leaves him forever or dies on the spot, right? And I'm just thinking about the difference between the spirit of the law and the actual writing of the law. And then I'm thinking about how that pertains to the book of life. And it's like, well, you can do everything to get your name in the book of life. And then I start to feel like a sleazy lawyer who's like working around the law, right? Like, I don't really have a question. I just have like a jumble of thoughts, and was wondering if you could shine some light on them for me.
I like the idea of the sort of working around as the lawyer. The Mishnah, the in Pirkei Avot says, don't be like servants who serve a master for a reward. And then we read a text which says, if you atone properly, then you get the reward of being in the book of life. And I think they're incompatible. So one has to go. And I'd rather get rid of the concept of book of life. To go back to Nomi's point of, what's the spiritual purpose here, right? What's the point here? I like the idea of being compelled to act in certain ways. I see the connection with what you were saying with that story. One redeeming thing for Abraham is perhaps when he says to his son Isaac, "V'nashuva," we will go up, we will offer, and we will return. Now, is he saying we will return because he doesn't want his son to know that this is what's going to happen, and so he's lying to his son? Or is he saying there's no way God will let me do this? So God will intervene somehow. So I believe that we will return. So even forced in a difficult situation, I believe in the fact that we can be redeemed and rescued from this difficult situation. So I guess those are added thoughts to that. So thank you, I appreciate it. Cindy.
Well, this is just a point of clarification. When you talk about the diaspora, did that start with the destruction of the first temple, the second temple, or later?
Okay, so the diaspora, yes, is the answer. So when the first temple was destroyed, you have the first exile, main exile of the Jewish people, although not all of them were exiled actually to Babylon. A lot of them were, but many of them weren't. It is believed by many people that that is where Judaism really was profoundly transformed, as it really picked up on Babylonian influence. So that's 586 before the Common Era. But then the Romans destroy the temple in 69 of the Common Era, so 2,000 years ago. And the Romans are absolutely fed up with the Jewish people. They are really fed up because they have been rebelling repeatedly. And you have these revolts, which some of them thought were messianic. This is the end of days. But you had these differing Jewish factions fighting each other while they were fighting the Romans, which certainly led to much more of a military defeat than would have happened otherwise. And the Romans say enough. And as far as they're concerned, they're like, get out. Once the temple is destroyed, the second temple is destroyed, this is the number of people who are killed is enormous. We're talking Holocaust level events in terms of both of them, actually. Particularly the destruction of the first temple is a tragedy of a similar scale to the Holocaust in terms of percentage of Jewish people. The destruction of the second temple, which was felt, this is it. We will eventually, the Messiah will come because the temple was standing, totally transforms Judaism. So the diaspora, the spreading out of Judaism is a totally traumatic event. And so we have this constant yearning to return. That's why we pray towards Jerusalem. We pray for the rebuilding of Jerusalem. Every time we take the scroll out of the Ark, Tivnei Chomot Yerushalayim, rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. We sing, interestingly, that was taken out of the Reform Siddur in England and then put back in. Because they're like, wait, we don't want the temple to be rebuilt there. There's a mosque there now. That would be really inconvenient. So this, the diaspora, you had an exile with the Babylonian exile, and you essentially have an exile with the Romans as well. Both of them totally transformed Judaism.
And the Holocaust would be another situation where people fled, if you were able to flee, fled Europe, or you were killed in Europe.
Yeah, but most of them couldn't. It's different. That's different to an exile, where an exile is you're forced out. And we will look in our history sessions about Jewish expulsions, because there were a lot of them. In fact, Jews were never legally allowed back into England. They just made their way back in. Jews are actually still exiled from England. So that's interesting, having been born in England and discovering legally I'm not actually allowed to be here. It's just nobody seemed to bother to revoke that law. But yeah, the Holocaust was different because actually most Jews were trapped. You did have the occasional thing, again, we'll look at this when we come to anti-Semitism, the kinder transport was some children were allowed out. I actually knew someone who was on the kinder transport. Just as things were getting bad, 1942, I think it was. Oh, maybe no, sorry, before that, 39, 40, I think kinder transport. I'll have to check. But otherwise, yeah, the passports were revoked, and so that wasn't an exile. That was a different kind of thing.
Okay, thank you.
Any final question or questions about Rosh Hashanah in particular? Salichot, Shofar, repentance, atonement, Elul, anything else? Well, we've covered a lot. We've definitely covered a lot. I'm going to end the recording. Are you sure you want to stop recording?